Hello, my name is Anna Moltchanova, and I teach philosophy at Carleton College in Minnesota in the United States. Thank you for viewing my presentation. My topic is about how to model certain types of institutional subordination. I will be talking about mostly white cisgender women, but their modeling I propose could be extended to other marginalized groups. Feminist scholars have pointed out that in an institutional context, the meaning and value of a woman's contributions are often distorted in how the rest of the group, often including other female group members, accepts these contributions. For example, Quill Kukla demonstrates that for a female speaker, a speech act can, by virtue of its uptake, become a different act than what it would typically be given its social context in standard discursive conversions. Kukla argues that in these cases, the audience's uptake fails to recognize the intentions of the speaker. One of her examples is of a woman in a supervisor position who issues an order, but it is perceived by her audience as a request. So its elocutionary force is changed. Moreover, not only a woman's intention as a player may be misrecognized, she may often simply not be given an uptake as a player in an institutional game that comes with certain discursive privileges. Similarly, Lynn Tyrrell points out that gender organizes hierarchies of power, including discursive powers, and often places women not in the same discursive game as the rest of the group is playing. The instances I focus on are different from the objects of Kukla's and Tyrrell's critiques. I look at the cases in which women are actually included in the same institutional game as their male counterparts, because their institutional role performances count by being utilized by the group and incorporated in the institutional functioning. It's through the defective attribution to the female performer that the performer is discounted. So the performance is perceived and incorporated as done properly. There are different types of gender-based subordination in the context of institutional status role. And the types that Kukla and Tyrrell model are number 1 and 2, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 I could call the incompetent player. So not only is the contribution not properly credited, it's also not used according to its merits because the woman's contribution is dismissed or treated as inferior. The second kind would be the non-player, because a woman can be made to play a different game when the framework for viewing her contribution is vastly different from the one used for men, even though she occupies equivalent institutional roles. I hope to clarify that subordination may not always manifest itself simply through the dismissal of performances as incompetent or as different kinds of acts, as it happens in type 1 and type 2 cases. In type 3 cases, which I'm going to talk about, the outcomes of institutional role performances are used in accordance with the rules of performance for the institutional role in question. But the system of subordination is perpetuated through frequent malattribution of these outcomes to female performers. Here's a true story. At a conference, a male presenter is answering a female colleague's question about his presentation. Another male colleague comes along and asks exactly the same question, which the presenter characterizes immediately as brilliant and worthy of an attribution in the footnote. If we use inferentialist terminology, both the female and the male attendees of the talk drew inferences from the presenter's assertions and formulated the same question that followed from what the presenter said. The female, almost authorlessly, in a depersonified way, assisted the question's entry and language-language transitions, but the question utilized in the presenter's thinking in the conversation in progress that the male attendee joined was not attributed to the female attendee as a valuable contribution. Thus, while the inference-making linguistic routine may go on uninterrupted, the perception of an individual's marginalized group status may influence how this individual's contribution that did produce proper inference sequences incorporated into the linguistic exchange are credited. Thus, the presenter's uptake both did and didn't recognize the female's attendee's intention as the speaker. To disambiguate, her intention of posing the question was recognized via the uptake of the question, but the intention wasn't attributed to her. She was discounted as the discussion participant who made the move. She ended up being an individual helpfully enabling the functioning of other group members, but her authorship of the institutionally recognized move of posing the question was not fully recognized. What needs to be modeled in the cases I focus on is not a matter of wrongly perceiving someone as incompetent, as in type 1 cases, or less powerful, and not ranking their contribution as high enough to be utilized, or as playing a different game, as in type 2 cases. What instead needs to be modeled is how the group actually uses the contribution and ignores or exploits the contributor. These latter cases that exist in addition to type 1 and type 2 cases are not explicitly addressed by the analysis like Tyrrell's and Kukla's. I clarify the mechanics of the cases that should be considered as a separate category, although they presently may be subsumed under no uptake, misunderstood, taken as incompetent, ignored in feminist analysis. Feminist approaches are effective in capturing the fact that women in the same kinds of institutional roles as men can still be in a subordinate position. What I intend to add to these approaches through my analysis here is to model how, in type 3 cases, women's performances may be both executed well and also accepted as having been executed well, all without the women responsible for those performances accruing the benefits of institutional recognition. Once again, to repeat, in type 3 cases, malattribution is not based on the performer's lack of competence, because the agent's contribution is incorporated as performed in compliance with the rules that govern the role performance. So basically, the woman's performance maintains, I would say, the nodes of institutional reality at which various commitments of institutional membership interlock. Therefore, we are looking not at the degraded assessment of the outcome based on the degraded assessment of the performer, but only at the degraded assessment of the performer. So how could we theorize this type of case? An institutional environment that produces type 3 cases, I argue, also creates what I will call the de facto domain of institutional status functions, which is a set of individuals for whom their particular performances for institutional roles are normally attributed to them as performed. Not all members of the group are so matched when performing their institutional roles, and thus only some are regularly located in the de facto domain and affirmed in repeated particular transactions as properly engaged with the institution. The degraded credit that marginalized members receive in type 3 cases is correlated not with the perceived lack of competence or ambition, but with whether this group member, a female in my case, is an outsider vis-a-vis those to whom the institutional culture is viewed as belonging. Regardless of their official institutional status, the outsiders to the de facto domain are often perceived as auxiliaries in a project authored by the insiders of the de facto domain. So in that case, just imagine an apprentice in a guild where the master of the guild is considered the author or kind of the owner of the enterprise, and their apprentices, even very competent and high-skilled performance, is still partially authorless and could be used by the master without proper attribution of the credit for its performance, because they're this kind of the space of this institutional production is the master's. The subtyping of institutional group membership women suffer from is historically conditioned and dynamically regenerated. So to interrupt this kind of looping process, it's necessary to make sure that credit is given when it's due. Therefore, the notion of institutional status role needs to be modified to capture how the attribution of a performance outcome that maintains institutional continuity depends on the performer's position with respect to the de facto domain. So how should we reflect the fact that a woman's or an individual's contributor status could systematically not match the institutional status of her contribution? So perhaps, as is suggested by Sally Haslanger in A Personal Communication, the proponent of the classic view of status functions could face the challenge by identifying two sets of constitutive rules: what constitutes the contribution and what constitutes a contributor, and amend the classical model with the introduction of two separate status functions at play. So action A counts as Y in C, and the agent who did A counts as having done Y in C. And in case of women, their action, in the examples I gave, counts as performed properly according to the rules, but the agent is not counted as having done that action fully or at all. The idea of two status functions adds a needed focus on an institutional actor's standing with respect to the de facto domain. However, we still need to explain how the two functions interact. Instead of explaining how the two functions relate, I introduce one status function that explicitly includes different membership categories to reflect how the credit of institutional role performances is often tied to the performer's status with respect to the de facto domain. So I introduced the status function with acceptance distortion, or SFAD, to reflect the malattribution. Malattribution is M-A-L, attribution, the bad kind. In institutional systems producing type 3 cases, group membership is implicitly stratified, and theorizing institutional roles in them requires a formula for status functions that is more complex than the classic formula X counts as Y in circumstances C. Status functions, or SF, needs to be modified to reflect the possibility of incongruence between the degree of acceptance of an outcome of a status role performance and the degree to which the outcome is attributed to the agent who produced it. For example, having done certain work counts as making a discovery in the lab. The discovery itself counts as made, but may not be attributed to the female scientist who produced it. The modified formula reflects the inconsistency between the crediting and the use of an outcome of a performance of an institutional role based on the performer's outsider status with respect to the de facto domain. And I should note that I'm not considering the full range of relations between incorporation and attribution, because I'm only discussing type 3 cases or subordination cases. I'm not dealing, for example, with other stereotyping-based instances in which an agent's performance is attributed as better than the actual performance outcome allows. So the formula I propose captures that an agent's performance counts as it should when incorporated into institutional functioning, which is different from type 1 and type 2 cases, while the performance is either properly attributed or malattributed depending on the insider or outsider status with respect to the de facto domain. So I qualify the classic formula in the following way. X counts as Y and C is conditionally collectively accepted, and X as intended and performed by person P in accordance with what's conditionally collectively accepted for the role in question counts as Y when incorporated in the institutional functioning. X as intended and performed by person P in accordance with 0 normally counts as Y when attributed to person P if P belongs to the de facto domain. And X as intended and performed by person P in accordance with 0 normally counts as Y minus or less than Y, or not Y even, when attributed to P if P doesn't belong to the de facto domain. The inconsistency between 1 and 2B may evade the group member's attention because the performance still counts as it should, and malattribution doesn't interfere with institutional functioning. Moreover, because a woman's performance may be collectively accepted as tied into the system of institutional commitments, even as she is ignored as a full contributor or collaborator, like in 2B. The woman herself may, for a time, not even notice her unequal or subordinate status in the group. Her action is institutionally accepted. The institution seems to be functioning as it should, and everything seems to work as it's supposed to until she is not chosen for promotion, for example. So SFAD, or my formula, makes evident what may help to counteract the subordinations that type 3 cases exhibit. We have to have effective safeguards to ensure that status role performances that marginalized group members execute are properly credited to them, so that all those formerly in the domain of the status role also comprises de facto domain. One effective measure might be to require the documented, explicit, and detailed evidence for each group member of their contributions to group projects. The mapping of an agent with respect to the de facto domain also allows us to represent what's happening in type 1 and type 2 cases. In type 1 cases, remember, there is no proper uptake of the intention of the speaker, say if these cases apply to speech acts, and the speaker may be perceived as incompetent or the performance is perceived in a modified way. There is a downgrading of the performance for the agents outside of the de facto domain. So X counts as Y and C is conditionally collectively accepted if P belongs to the de facto domain. X, as intended and performed by person P in accordance with 0, normally counts as Y. And if P doesn't belong to the de facto domain, X, as intended and performed by person P in accordance with 0, is likely to be perceived as different from X, or like defective X. And it counts as less than Y or not Y, both when incorporated in the institutional functioning and when it is attributed to person P. I will refrain, given the function that represents type 1 cases a name, but it is different from SFAD. In type 2 cases, when there is no uptake of the individual as a player, and the individual has to play by different rules, if P doesn't belong to the de facto domain, they are forced to play under ever-shifting and indefinable rules, neither freely chosen nor publicly accepted, that do not match conditionally collectively accepted description of the role according to which the crediting occurs. Thus, they perform the action, which is not actually X, which they should be performing, but kind of X prime, which hardly counts as Y and C because it is perceived as a defective X. Since the agent's outsider status excludes them from playing the game by the rules according to which they are judged, the agent's efforts are bound to fall short. So X prime, as intended and performed, counts as Y minus or not Y and C. Does this detailing of various non-ideal circumstances disintegrate the notion of institutional role so that we no longer can have a definition? It certainly changes the notion, but various cases of malattribution preserve the same element. The existence of conditionally collectively accepted rules for institutional role performance, marked 0 in the models above, in accordance with which the outcomes are incorporated as performed properly and in accordance with which the institution continues to exist. This offers a helpful anchor for identifying different ways in which marginalization occurs, and on this basis finding potential sites of resistance specific to each type of case. Various modifications to the classic model of status function are needed based on various combinations of what an institutional role holder intends to perform and performs in circumstances C, what the group perceives the agents to perform, what it does with the outcome, and how it credits the agent. Focusing on how a performance is credited based on the agent's status with respect to the de facto domain allows us to lay the foundation for introducing these modifications. Thank you.